A soldier came home from the battlefield, thinking he had survived every kind of pain until the day he heard his daughter whisper, "It hurts when I sit down." And when he learned the truth, he collapsed. The town was called Grey Pines. It was late autumn. The sun dipped below the horizon early, and rows of old wooden houses seemed to bow under the shadows of dried-out oak trees. A bus came to a stop on the gravel shoulder, its tires letting out a faint squeal on the damp ground. Jack O'Hara stepped off, slinging an old faded army backpack over one shoulder, the straps frayed at the edges. He paused for a few seconds, straightened his back, and glanced around the way soldiers do out of habit. Only then did he start walking forward. The town looked the same as the last time he'd left it, just colder, quieter. Dry leaves chased each other in the wind, piling up beneath shuttered storefronts. On a weathered wooden sign at the corner, the paint had faded, but still read, "The Lord is our refuge." Jack walked with steady steps, still wearing his desert boots from Kuwait. The wind tugged at the hem of his coat. He made his way down Main Street, all the way to the white-painted house, at the end a narrow porch out front, a crooked chimney on top. The door opened before he could knock. Helen O'Hara stood there, a scarf wrapped around her neck, holding a coffee mug gone cold. "My Jack, come in, honey," she said. Jack nodded instead of speaking. He stepped inside, set his backpack down near the foot of the stairs, and took a quick glance around the living room, an oak dining table, the old armchair where his father used to read the paper, framed photos still hanging neatly on the walls. Nothing new, but somehow everything felt too unchanged. "Emily's still asleep," Helen said, turning away. "She stayed up late finishing her homework." Jack didn't ask anything else. He poured himself a glass of water and stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where tiny footprints pressed into the morning frost. He set the glass down and headed for the stairs. Emily's room was upstairs, at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar. Jack stood there a moment before gently knocking. "It's Dad," he said. No reply. He pushed the door open and stepped in. The room was simple, a single wooden bed, a small desk, a few toys neatly stacked in the corner. Emily was lying on her side, clutching a pillow to her chest. Her long brown hair covered most of her face. Morning light came through the curtains, Teensfakens casting soft patterns across the blanket. Jack sat down on the edge of the bed. He didn't touch her. Instead, he said quietly, "Daddy's home, sweetheart." She stirred. Her eyes opened slightly, then closed again without a word. Breakfast was quiet. Helen sat across from him, eating scrambled eggs one bite at a time with a metal fork. Emily sat beside her, never leaving her seat. Jack shared a few light stories from the base, nothing about war, just the kind of everyday things soldiers talk about. "There was this new guy from Texas," he said. "Thought the sand in Iraq was like cornmeal. When you sweat, it clings to you like biscuit dough." Helen gave a faint laugh. Emily kept eating, her face expressionless, not giving any sign that she was listening. Jack watched his daughter. Her hand gripped the spoon, fingernails clipped short. A faint scratch marked her right wrist. He looked for a long time, but said nothing. That afternoon, Jack asked Emily if she wanted to take a walk around the neighborhood. She didn't say no, but she didn't smile either. They passed the old bakery, the library, then the playground behind the church. Children were running, throwing leaves, taking turns on the slide. Emily didn't join in. She stood behind Jack, her shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on the ground. "Do you want to play?" Jack asked. Emily shook her head. A child ran past, nearly bumping into her. She flinched and stepped back. Jack placed his hand on her shoulder. It was cold and tense. "It's okay," he said, and gently led her back. That first night, Jack read a story to Emily Charlotte's Webb, its pages worn at the edges. His voice was low and steady, careful to keep a slow, clear rhythm. Emily lay with her face turned to the wall. When he reached the part where Charlotte spun her first message into the web, Emily whispered so softly, Jack thought it might have been the wind. "Dad." Jack stopped reading. "Yeah?" She spoke without turning around. "It really hurts when I sit down." The words dropped into the room like a knock no one wanted to hear. Jack set the book down and sat up straight. "Did you fall?" Emily didn't answer. Jack kept his voice even. "When did that happen, sweetheart?" The little girl pulled the blanket higher, without saying another word. Jack didn't press her. He sat by the bed for a moment longer, then stood up and turned off the nightlight. Streetlight filtered through the curtains, casting a faint glow on the wall. Jack left the room, closing the door gently behind him. Downstairs, he walked straight into the kitchen. On the table, beside the sugar jar and a worn tablecloth, a picture frame lay face down. Jack turned it over. The photo had faded with time. Him, Natalie, his wife, and Emily at age 2. Natalie held Emily from behind, her head tilted toward Jack with a smile. She died 3 years ago. A car accident late at night on her way home after an extra shift. By the time the message reached Jack's unit in Kuwait, she had already been buried. He hadn't had time to call, hadn't had time to say goodbye. Since then, Emily had lived with her grandmother. Jack stayed on duty, trying to keep up with letters, care packages, recorded birthday wishes, but the replies came less and less. Helen wasn't one for phone calls. She didn't believe kids should be asked too many questions. And Emily, his daughter, grew up in silence, with no one asking what she saw, what scared her, what she needed. Upstairs, Emily had turned to face the window. She still wasn't asleep, just stared at the moon through the sheer curtain, her arms wrapped around her knees. A bruise, already fading to pale purple, peeked out from under her nightclothes. And he truly hadn't expected that behind what had seemed like an offhand comment from Emily, there was a quiet truth so deep he couldn't reach it with battlefield instincts, or even all the years he had spent surviving silence. The next morning, the clock chimed softly at 6. Jack had already been awake. He poured coffee in silence, his eyes resting on the army backpack, its straps still fastened. Upstairs, Emily's small footsteps sounded faintly. She was walking slowly, a bit hesitant. Helen was setting breakfast on the table, fried eggs, white toast, orange juice. Everything was neat. Not much was said. Emily sat at the corner of the table, her hands tucked under it, her eyes fixed on her plate. "You're going to school today," Helen said, without looking up. "You need to start over, be on time like the other kids." Emily gave a small nod, saying nothing more. Jack looked at his daughter, then at her mother. He started to speak, but stopped. It wasn't the right time. Not enough pieces yet. He still didn't understand what was slipping between the silences in this kitchen. The elementary school was less than 3 blocks from the house. Jack held Emily's hand on the walk over, but she gradually pulled it away. In front of the school gates, kids tugged at their backpacks, laughing and rushing toward each other. Emily didn't greet anyone, and no one greeted her. "What class are you most excited for today?" Jack asked, trying to keep his tone light. "I guess geometry," Emily said. Her voice was barely louder than a breeze through a sleeve. As they neared the classroom door, a young teacher stepped out. Her name was Miss Clara Tall, hair tied neatly back, her face more stern than her appearance suggested. "This is Emily's father." She spoke in a flat, rehearsed tone. Jack gave a light handshake. Clara didn't hold his gaze for long. "She's a sweet girl, does fairly well in school, but a bit absent-minded. We're helping her adjust, little by little." She bent down and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. The girl flinched slightly, her eyes fixed on the ground. Clara withdrew her hand, still smiling. "Go on to class now, Emily." Emily stepped away from Jack and walked into the classroom without looking back. Her back was stiff, her steps steady, but heavy. Jack stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, watching the door close behind her. On his way home, Jack stopped by the old grocery store, once Natalie's regular spot. The new owner was a middle-aged woman named Dottie. She spoke quickly, cheerfully, but her eyes kept shifting, as if scanning for ripples in the air. "Mr. O'Hara, isn't it? Heard you were back. The whole town knows. Well, you came just in time. The fall festival's coming up. Emily'll probably enjoy it." "I hope so," Jack replied, picking out a few things. Another woman spoke from behind the counter without looking at him. "As long as she doesn't act up like some of the others. My kid got punished last week, had to stand facing the wall for nearly an hour. In the morals class. At school." Jack turned to her. "Nope, Wednesday afternoons at the church. Reverend Dale runs it. Says it's to teach kids how to listen." "An hour?" Jack repeated. Maybe more. Kids these days need to learn boundaries." The woman pursed her lips and shook her head. "They're too coddled nowadays." Jack gave a small nod, saying nothing more, but in his mind, the image of Emily curled up in the chair reappeared. He saw that scene more clearly than the road home. That afternoon, Jack was tidying up the laundry room behind the house. Emily had left her dirty clothes in the basket next to the machine. When he opened it, about to load the washer, he paused. A pair of grey leggings. Near the hip, under the fabric, there was a faint purple smudge, like an old bruise. He reached out to touch it but stopped himself. No sudden moves. He took the leggings out, folded them neatly, and placed them in a separate basket. Then he left the laundry room without telling anyone. That evening, while Emily was sitting in the armchair reading, Jack sat down beside her. He didn't ask right away. He simply said, "I'll take you to school tomorrow. Let's leave a little early. We'll swing by the bakery." Emily gave a small nod. "You doing okay?" "Yes." She didn't look at him. Jack waited a few seconds, then rested his hand on the back of the chair. "If something's making you uncomfortable, you can talk to me." Emily closed her book and held it to her chest. "It's okay, Dad. Everything's normal." That word, normal, made Jack sit still. He knew that kind of normal. Like the kids he'd talked to after a round of shelling, everything's still normal, when their whole village had been turned to ash. That night, Helen was watching TV in the living room. Jack sat across from her, eyes fixed on the screen, though he wasn't really watching. Finally, he asked, "Do you think Emily seems okay?" "She's fine. She's always been a well-behaved girl." "I'm not so sure." "What do you mean?" "She's scared. She avoids eye contact. She flinches when someone touches her. Something's not right." Helen leaned forward and muted the TV. She rested her hands on her knees and looked at her son. Kids these days are always saying they're tired or scared. What they need is discipline. "You're being too sensitive. Did you ever hit Emily?" Helen's eyes narrowed. "You think I'm that kind of person?" Jack didn't answer, not because he believed she had hit Emily, but because he wasn't sure his mother understood what real hurt looked like. He stood up and left the living room. Upstairs, Emily had already gone to her room and closed the door. Jack walked up slowly. As he passed, the door quivered slightly in the draught. Inside, the soft yellow glow of a nightlight spilled through the crack. There was the faint rustle of paper. He stood there for a while, didn't knock, didn't speak, just stood in silence. Outside, the wind moved across the porch. The air was starting to chill, and Jack realized the cold in this house wasn't coming from the weather. Wednesday morning, while Helen was busy doing the dishes and Emily was getting ready for school, Jack stood silently in front of the calendar on the kitchen wall, right next to a small handwritten note, faint blue ink in her familiar script. Morality class, 4 p.m. Church. Jack kept an eye on Emily the whole morning. When the school bell rang to end the day, instead of heading home, she turned toward the main road and cut across the back of the schoolyard toward the chapel. Alone. Not speaking to anyone. Jack walked slowly along the opposite side of the street. He didn't call out, didn't reveal himself. Standing behind a utility pole, he watched. The side door of the church opened. Emily and a few other children stepped inside. No one spoke. No laughter. Each child set their bag down and took a seat on the long wooden bench in the small room just off the main hall. The door closed behind them with a soft, steady click, like part of a ritual. Jack made his way around to the back of the church. There was a small window with peeling paint, about shoulder height. He stood on tiptoe and looked in. Yellow light spilled from an old ceiling bulb, casting a pale glow over the straight rows of benches. 10 children, sitting upright, backs straight, eyes fixed on the small lectern, hands neatly placed on their laps. No one spoke, no one moved, lips closed, eyes blank. At the front, Reverend Dale stood motionless, holding a slim book in one hand, his voice low and steady. No accusations, no scolding, just questions, soft as water soaking in. If you don't know how to be still, how can you hear anything worth hearing? Discipline is not punishment, it's the choice that leads to salvation. Good children don't need to be reminded more than once. Jack didn't stay to hear it all. He stepped back, turned, and walked toward the gate. The following afternoon, Jack went to the school to find Miss Clara Emily's homeroom teacher. She was gathering papers in the classroom. When she saw him, Clara gave a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. O'Hara. Is something the matter?" "I wanted to ask about the ethics class Emily's been attending. Who's in charge of it? Is it supervised?" Clara hesitated, straightening a stack of folders. "That class is an extracurricular activity. It's not under the school's jurisdiction. The church oversees it. Reverend Dale teaches it himself." "Does anyone review the material, or how he teaches the kids?" Clara avoided his gaze. "I believe he's a respected figure in the community. Children need discipline. You know, we can't always allow everything to revolve around feelings." Jack looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not talking about feelings. I'm talking about fear." Clara pressed her lips together. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face, but quickly faded. She took a step back, resting her hand on the edge of the desk. "I'm sorry. I don't have anything more to say." Jack gave a nod and walked out of the classroom. On his way home, he swung by the police station, where Sheriff Carter, an old friend, was sitting out front with a cup of coffee in hand. Carter spotted Jack from a distance, raised a hand in greeting, then rested his elbow on his knee, eyes squinting in the sunlight. "You look like you're about to stir up trouble," Carter said, half joking, half not. Jack didn't smile. "I'm just asking." "You usually only ask when you already think you know the answer," Carter replied, his voice steady, not sharp, but not soft either. Jack sat down on the wooden bench beside him, speaking slowly. "I stopped by the church ethics class, looked in through the window. The kids were sitting like statues, no expression, no movement. And? You don't think there's something wrong with that? I think the kids around here behave better than most city kids. No acting out, no swearing. Might be thanks to that class." Jack tilted his head toward Carter. "Emily's got a bruise on her thigh. She says it hurts when she sits. I want to know why." Carter was quiet for a moment, fingers tapping lightly against the rim of his cup. Then he spoke, voice lower. "Listen, Jack. You just got back. Things here are steady. Don't go kicking the beehive before you know what's inside." Jack turned to him. "So if your kid came home too scared to sit at the dinner table, you'd call that steady?" Carter didn't answer, just looked Jack in the eye, then back out toward the street. Jack stood up. "I'm not here to make trouble, but if something's wrong, I'm not staying quiet." That night, Jack sat in the living room with his old laptop open. He was looking up information on Reverend Dale. Not much came up. A clean record, a few short articles praising the guardian of traditional morals in Bell's Hollow. He clicked on Dale's profile picture, a man in his 50s, lean build, wearing a white shirt and a dark tie. His eyes were bright, but cold. There was nothing overtly frightening about that face, except Jack had seen those eyes fix on Emily the other day, and how she had shivered under their gaze. Jack closed the laptop. For the first time, he felt something like a small noise in the night, not loud, not clear, but enough to keep you from sleeping. The next morning, Jack drove Emily to school early. On the way, he asked, "Would you like to skip the ethics class?" Emily blinked, hesitated. "If I skip, I'll get in trouble. Reverend Dale said anyone who misses has to do a private lesson with him." Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "From now on, I'll be waiting for you after that class. Okay?" Emily nodded softly, as if nodding too hard might get her scolded. Jack didn't say anything more. He watched her walk into the school, backpack slipping off one shoulder, posture straight but slow. A light wind passed through. Yellow maple leaves floated down onto the stone walkway. Jack watched them, then turned away, as if he already understood. From this moment on, silence was no longer an option. Friday morning, the sky was a heavy grey. Last night's rain had left puddles across the entryway, and the damp earth in the front yard gave off a scent like wet rust. Jack opened the front door, planning to take the trash bin out to the curb, when he saw a small envelope lying on the doormat. There was no return address. The envelope was a pale yellow, its edges slightly crumpled, with a faint damp mark, maybe from dew or a trembling finger. He picked it up and looked around. The street was empty. A cold wind slipped under his collar. Jack stepped back inside, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table. Carefully, he opened the envelope. Inside was a plain sheet of printer paper, nothing distinctive, no watermark, no greeting, no signature, just a short paragraph, centered on the page, as if the writer had wanted each word to stand alone. "I used to teach ethics, not for long. I left when the children were made to sit for hours without water, without speaking, without moving. The ones who disrupted were punished with silence. One child passed out. No one told her parents. Everyone knew, but everyone was afraid. Don't trust silence. It isn't peace." Jack read it again, and again. The last line made his hand tighten. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. He folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope. Carefully. No tears, no creases. It wasn't evidence in court, but it felt like enough to make his chest ache, like something heavy was pressing down on it. That night, long after dark, Jack passed by Emily's room. The door was ajar. Her nightlight cast a thin line of gold across the wooden floor. He was about to keep walking, then he heard a soft, rustling sound. He turned back and pushed the door open. Emily was standing beside the bed, her eyes open, but not truly seeing. She faced the window, whispering, "I won't speak anymore. I won't sit down again. Reverend Sir." Her words broke apart, like the last breath of a child lost in a dream. Jack stepped forward and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. Emily flinched and collapsed to the floor. She covered her knees with her hands, her eyes wild with fear. "It's me. Just me, sweetheart. Just Dad." Emily panted. It took her a few seconds to realize she was no longer in the classroom, no longer at the front of the room, just her own bedroom. Jack lifted her back onto the bed, pulled the blanket over her, sat beside her for over an hour without saying a word. He couldn't. Not now. The next morning, after Helen dropped Emily off early for her group session at school, Jack walked toward the Western housing tract. He brought nothing with him but a quarter-folded piece of paper now creased a few more times than before. Last night, while checking through an old backpack, he had found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single handwritten line. "If you really want to know, find Rachel Klein." She's not afraid anymore. No signature. But the handwriting was firm, without hesitation. And more important, the name brought back the image of a face he had glimpsed at the town supermarket a few days earlier. A woman with brown hair, thin frame, walking alongside a boy about Emily's age. Her eyes had faltered for just a moment when they met Jack's, as if she knew he was trying to see into the things the whole town was trying not to. He followed his memory to the last street in the old neighborhood. A low-roofed house stood there, with a row of scraggly lavender bushes by the front steps. Rachel Klein was folding a blanket over the clothesline when she saw Jack approaching. She hesitated, but didn't look surprised. "You read the letter?" Jack nodded. "I guessed right then," Rachel said softly, turning toward the house. "Come in. But I'm not sure there's much to say." Jack stepped inside, leaving his shoes on. The house was tidy, with a few watercolor paintings on the wall, probably done by her child. "Your kid went to the ethics class too?" Rachel nodded, pouring tea into a brown ceramic mug. "He did. Then he started wetting the bed at night, wouldn't sit down to eat dinner. When I asked him why, all he said was, 'If I tell, I'll have to be alone with him.'" She sat down in a chair, her hands clasped tightly. "I was going to tell someone, but—" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "Everyone knows. But no one wants to be the first to say it. Whoever speaks up gets seen as a troublemaker. The church is the backbone of this town. Dale is its spine. That why you quit working at the church?" Rachel was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I used to think I was weak for walking away. But now I think maybe I still had enough strength left to survive." Jack laid the envelope on the table. "You sent this?" Rachel didn't confirm, but something in her eyes softened. "I just didn't want you to be alone." That night, after Emily went to bed, Jack sat down to write. He opened his old army notebook, the one he used to record artillery coordinates, and began noting down every small behavior of Emily's. The time, the signs, the things she said in her sleep. He sketched the layout of the room, marked where the light came in, where Emily usually stood when she sleepwalked. Every line he wrote felt like a cut, but he wrote slowly, steadily, with care. Like the first time he diffused a tripwire out in the field, knowing that even the slightest mistake could blow everything apart. He didn't know what he would do next, but for the first time, he knew this. He wouldn't stay silent, not for one more night. Outside the window, the church bell stirred lightly in the wind. No one had rung it, but its echo was enough to make Jack tighten his grip on the pen. The church bells rang, early, each chime steady and resonant, as if nothing could disrupt the routine. Elderly couples dressed neatly, children in tidy clothes. The people of Bell's Hollow flowed toward the chapel, like a river that had never changed course. Just like every year, Jack moved against the flow. No Sunday best. A dark coat, hands in his pockets, eyes cold and calm. He didn't enter through the front, but slipped around to the side gate. The rear wooden door, usually meant for staff, stood slightly ajar. Inside, Reverend Dale was arranging hymnals. The colored glass cast a soft light across his face, giving him a fleeting air of sanctity, a perfect moment for a memorial portrait. if it ever came to that. Jack stepped in. No knock, no pleasantries. "I don't need you teaching my kid obedience," he said flatly. "I need him to feel safe." Dale didn't look up right away. His hand smoothed the final page, as if that task took precedence. Then he turned, offering a small, polite smile, cordial, but devoid of warmth. "We both serve the same purpose, Mr. O'Hara. I just take a different path." "If your path walks over children, it's not a path, it's a pit," Jack replied. Dale's eyes paused at Jack's clenched fist. Then he spoke, slowly, his voice deep and deliberate, like a sermon. "A father returned from the battlefield, burdened by the fear of losing control over what he once held firm. I understand. But be careful, Mr. O'Hara. Around here, rebellion is often mistaken for disruption." Jack stepped closer. "And silence is often mistaken for faith. But don't forget, I've seen silence kill, with bombs, with wire, with indifference." Dale still smiled. "You're lost, Jack." Jack nodded, took a step back, voice low. "Then I'll walk my own way." He left the church without looking back. That afternoon, Emily sat drawing in her room. She used crayons, silent, making sure Jack couldn't see. It wasn't until after dinner that he noticed the sheet of paper, folded into thirds, resting at the edge of the table by the window. He opened it. A simple, yet detailed drawing. A long brown bench stretching across a dark space. Beneath the bench, a large black shadow, no clear shape. On the bench, a small child, brown hair, long-sleeved shirt curled up, hugging her knees, face turned away. In the corner, written in thin lettering, "I promise to be good if I don't have to sit anymore." Jack folded the drawing back up and placed it in his nightstand drawer. This time, he didn't just remember. He kept it. A few days later, Rachel Klein began making phone calls to other parents. She chose carefully those who had quietly pulled their children from ethics class or had shown signs of doubt. The conversations were discreet, even avoiding the name Dale altogether. But bit by bit, the pieces began to come together. One mother said her child had been forced to stand outside in the cold for giving the wrong answer. A young boy said he'd once been locked away to relearn obedience. No one had proof. No one dared speak out loud. But they knew. Everyone knew. Word traveled just as quickly in the other direction. At the grocery store, an older woman whispered to the man behind the bread counter, "That Jack fellow shows up out of nowhere and starts trouble. Think he's going to teach the whole town how to raise kids?" Another woman shook her head. "The girl's just sensitive. It's not the church's fault. He's hurting his own mother. Helen's whole life has been about her faith." The next morning, in the kitchen, Helen slammed her teacup down on the table. "What the hell are you doing, Jack? I'm protecting Emily by dragging Reverend Dale through the mud. Do you even understand who he is in this town? A man with too much power and no one willing to question him. He's made those kids into decent people, not like the ones running wild out there. Kids don't go bad on their own. It starts with adults who don't know when to stop." Helen stood up and pointed her finger. "From now on, I forbid Emily from setting foot in that church. Not because of her, but because of you. I won't let that girl become your excuse to pull others in." Jack rose slowly. He didn't argue. He simply said, "She's not an excuse. She's the reason." That night, Jack sat alone in his room at the wooden desk. He opened the drawer and took out the drawing Emily had made. He laid it flat on the desk, pressing his hand over it like he needed to confirm it was still real. Outside, the wind chimes whispered softly, but in Jack's mind, the chimes had gone silent. What remained was a quiet beginning to a fire, smoldering, patient, and beyond the reach of prayer. Monday morning, there was no rain, but the sun wasn't strong enough to chase away the chill that had begun to settle into the ground. Jack sat in his car at the school gate, eyes following Emily as she got out. She had her backpack on and walked steadily, not in a hurry. Her steps were no longer stiff like last week's, but they still didn't seem quite natural. When she reached the playground, Emily slowed down. A group of 3 kids playing jump rope turned their faces away. One boy, maybe 8 years old, pointed and whispered just loud enough for Jack to catch through the half-lowered window. "That's the girl whose dad hates church." Emily stood still for a few seconds. Then she lowered her head and walked quickly to the other side of the yard, where no one else was standing. Jack clenched his jaw tight, but he didn't get out of the car. Not yet. It wasn't time. Around noon, Jack stopped by the post office to check his mail. In the sparse line, he spotted a familiar face, Mrs. Elver, the old postal clerk with silver hair, small eyes, a hunched back, and the habit of still riding her bike every evening. When she saw Jack, she stepped out from behind the counter and pressed a dark brown envelope into his hand. "This came last week, but got dropped in the wrong box. No signature, but I figured you ought to read it." Jack took the envelope, looked at her. "Who's it from?" "Name goes way back. Claire Jensen. Used to teach ethics class. Lives out in Idaho now. Nobody's heard from her since she left." Jack said thank you, stepped out to his car, and opened the envelope as soon as he sat down. Inside was a thin sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The handwriting was in blue ink, rounded, neat, but slightly shaky. "I used to teach at Bell's Hollow. I left when I saw children being punished by being made to sit for hours in a cold room, no water, no talking, just for asking too many questions. One girl, Ellie M., cried silently, and I was asked to take a leave of absence for comforting her too much. I can't prove any of it. No one there stood with me. But I believe if someone is now asking the same questions I once asked, he deserves to know. Emily wasn't the first, and I'm afraid she won't be the last." Jack read it 3 times. By the third, his hand trembled slightly. He folded the letter and tucked it carefully into the inside pocket of his coat. Then he started the car. That afternoon, Jack went to see Rachel. She opened the door more slowly than usual, her eyes unsettled. "I can't talk long," she said. "Someone from the parish board came to the school. They asked about me, about parents who've been voicing concerns." Jack looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You're scared?" he asked. Rachel bit her lip, gave a small nod. "I have a son, Jack. I need this job. We're not the same. You can walk away. I can't." "You think I can walk away with my child still here?" Rachel stepped back, hand rising to her chest. She didn't respond. Just slowly closed the door. Jack turned away, his chest heavy, as if he'd just lost an ally he hadn't even had the chance to ask for. Late in the afternoon, Jack arrived at the quiet cafe on the corner, the kind of place where only a few old men played chess, and the silent, wooden-faced Asian owner moved like part of the furniture. Carter was already there, sitting at the farthest table, his back to the door. Jack pulled out a chair and sat down. "I just got a letter from Claire Jensen." Carter didn't look surprised. He simply poured the coffee and slid it toward Jack. "I never said you were wrong. I said, you picked the wrong time. Then when is the right time? When you have proof, when someone's backing you. Right now, all you've got is your own shadow. And your daughter." Jack looked at his friend. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. "And you? Where do you stand?" Carter set his cup down on the table, slower than usual. "The more you try to expose, the more I have to cover. I can't afford to lose this town, Jack." "So, you'll keep it by stepping on children?" Carter let out a long breath. "I'm keeping it by not letting it burn from the inside. And you're striking matches, Jack. Wet ones. Maybe, but still matches. They sat in silence for a few seconds. Finally, Jack stood up, leaving the coffee untouched. He didn't say another word. Carter didn't call him back. By the time Jack got home, it was already dark. The wind had picked up. In the kitchen, Helen was nowhere in sight. A sliver of light glowed from under Emily's door, but it was locked. Jack knocked gently. "Emily, it's Dad." No answer. He tried turning the knob, it wouldn't budge. From inside, there was the sound of a chair being dragged. Then silence. Jack stood still in front of the closed door. He didn't knock again. He just placed his hand on the wood, without pressure, as if touching a thin wall between the present moment and what he was about to face. Inside, the room remained quiet. No crying, no footsteps. The silence didn't frighten Jack. It made him sad. Sad because he used to believe that just coming home would make everything all right again. But it didn't. Emily had learned to protect herself by pulling away, and that made him feel like he was late again. He sat down on the floor, his back against the wall across from her door. He didn't raise his voice, just spoke softly enough for the sound to slip through the crack. "When I was on the battlefield, there were nights so cold nobody could sleep. But the cold wasn't the scary part. Not knowing where anybody was, that's what got to you. There was this young soldier, 18 years old, shivering in the corner of the tent. He didn't talk, didn't eat, didn't move for 3 days straight. He paused, breathing slowly, but on the 4th day he said, 'If I don't talk about it, I'll never stop being afraid.' And he did. Just once. But after that, he started lifting his head, standing straighter, breathing deeper. From inside the room, the door latch turned gently, but it didn't open. Jack continued, 'Emily, you don't have to tell me everything. Just know this. You don't have to be afraid alone. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere.' There was a pause, then a question, so soft it nearly got carried away by the breeze outside the porch. 'If I tell, do you think people will believe me?' Jack swallowed hard. That question cut across memories he couldn't forget of times people stayed silent to keep the peace, no matter how much the vulnerable suffered. 'Maybe not everyone,' he said slowly. 'But enough will listen. And once someone listens, you're not alone anymore. Because if everyone stays silent, then the first person to speak is the only one still truly alive.' Saturday afternoon, the Bells Hollow Community Centre was as quiet as it always was on weekends. Out front, a wooden sign held a few chalk-scrawled lines. "Parent meeting, 4 p.m., room 2. Jack had set up the chairs himself around noon. 3 rows of grey plastic chairs, 6 in each row. A folding table sat in front of the small stage, holding a water jug and a few paper cups. He hadn't hung a banner, no posters either. Just a spoken invitation, murmured through closed doors, to those still brave enough to listen. By the time the clock hit 4, only 8 people had shown up, mostly women. They entered one by one, offering faint nods to each other, sitting far apart like unstitched wounds, afraid to be touched. Rachel came too, but didn't walk up front. She took the last seat in the back, clutching her purse tightly. Emily came with Jack. She wore a pale blue sweater, her hair braided into 2 neat plaits, her face serious, almost unblinking. When she sat down in the front row, she didn't look around. She kept her eyes on her closed fists in her lap. Jack didn't stand up to speak. He simply nodded to the room, then turned to Emily. "If you're ready, you can start." Emily stood up. She stepped into the middle of the small room, where the late afternoon light slanted through a thin white curtain. The room fell silent. No one rushed her. No one interrupted. Her voice came out quiet, but steady. "I don't know what I did wrong, I just said I needed to use the bathroom. Reverend Dale said I disrupted a sacred lesson. Then he wouldn't let me go back to my seat. He made me sit on a chair against the wall. Emily paused and took a breath. That chair didn't have a desk. I sat there until everyone left. He turned off the lights. No one came back to check on me. I sat there alone. I didn't tell anyone when I got home because he said, God loves silence. She lifted her head and looked around the room, full of silent adults. I don't know if God wants my legs to hurt, but I think if God loves me, He'd want me to sit somewhere that doesn't hurt so much. There was a muffled sob. It wasn't clear who it came from. I didn't tell Dad right away because I didn't know if he'd believe me. But now I think, if I don't say anything, someone else might have to go through the same thing. She didn't cry. Her voice stayed even, but her eyes began to glisten, not from fear, but from relief. Emily took a step back, her gaze searching for her father. Jack nodded just once, quietly, but it was enough to let her know. She wasn't standing alone anymore. And when the first woman began to cry, and another mother finally spoke up, Emily no longer drew her shoulders in. She stood tall, didn't back away, her hands still clenched, but steady. As if, for the first time, she knew her voice could be heard, and it deserved to be. Rachel took a breath, then stood up. We've been silent for too long. Out of fear of being isolated, fear of losing our reputation, our jobs, our friends. But what about our children? They're the ones who will carry the wounds if we don't stand up. We won't let them suffer anymore. I won't stay silent. Silence, then applause. Not loud, not in unison. A few scattered claps at first, then more, like the first drops of a spring rain few, but genuine. Jack stayed in the back. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Today wasn't his day. It was Emily's. The day she stopped being the one who endured and became the one who opened the first door. He looked at his daughter. She wasn't smiling, but her lips were no longer pressed tight. Her shoulders had softened. Her eyes rested on the west-facing window. The late afternoon sun touched her forehead like a soft halo. Jack understood. He was no longer fighting alone. And more than anything, Emily had found her voice again. The church bell rang 4 times that day. Long, resonant. As if Reverend Dale wanted to make it clear this wasn't a regular service, but a gathering, a call for faith, unity, and community order. Nearly the entire town showed up. People weren't dressed fancy, but properly like they would for a court hearing. They hadn't come to pray. They came to see what Jack O'Hara would do, and how Reverend Dale would respond. In the third pew, Jack sat beside Emily. Her arms were drawn in close, lips pressed tight. Her eyes flicked now and then toward the pulpit, where Dale was already standing white robe, Bible in hand, like a symbol of unquestioned authority. Jack lowered his head and spoke softly, just enough for her to hear. You don't have to speak until you're ready. I'm here. Emily didn't answer, but she gave a small nod, a subtle motion, like pulling herself out of the darkness inside. The ceremony began with unsourced quotations. The Lord said, "He who sows doubt among the faithful is the hand of darkness." When a family rises against the word, corruption begins with the child. Jack sat still, his hands clasped. Inside the pocket of his coat was a small USB drive. He had transferred the video Rachel had given him. As the sermon gradually shifted from guidance to insinuation, a vague silence settled over the sanctuary. Dale raised his voice. Some believe they're acting in truth, but truth cannot come from chaos, and it cannot come from the mouths of children who do not yet understand right from wrong. I ask you, who among you here believes in obedience? Before anyone could respond, Jack stood. He didn't walk up to the pulpit. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the USB drive, and held it up. I have a video. It was recorded from the hallway camera outside the classroom late in the afternoon, right here at the church. In it, there's a child not talking, not misbehaving, just standing up to ask to leave, and his hand was grabbed. He was shoved back into his seat. No shouting, but it was clearly forced. Dale smiled faintly. He nodded. These days, people believe in video more than the Bible. They believe in camera angles, not the truth. What's a video clip worth when it's cut from 10 hours of footage? There's another letter, Jack added, from Claire Jensen, former ethics teacher. She witnessed punishments that went on for hours. Kids fainted, and no one ever told the parents. Dale's tone didn't soften. Everyone who's left this community carries wounds, but not because of the church, because they couldn't handle discipline. They chose to run instead of change themselves. At that, Emily clasped her hands tight in her lap. She was trembling, not from the cold, but from standing right on the edge between fear and courage. "You don't have to say anything," Jack whispered. Emily shook her head. She stood up. She walked slowly down the center aisle of the church, where everyone could see her clearly. She wore a pale sweater, her hair tied to one side, her eyes wide open. A heavy silence settled over the room. "I used to think obeying meant not crying," Emily said. Her voice shook, but it was steady enough to carry. "I didn't understand why I was being punished. I didn't do anything wrong. I just asked to go to the bathroom." A woman burst into tears. A man stood, then sat back down. No one spoke. Emily went on. "I thought I was a bad person, but now I understand. I wasn't wrong, I was just a child." Dale smiled, his first smile that looked uneasy. "Even a child can be led astray, folks. Who's feeding her these words? Who's putting her up to defy her faith?" Jack didn't move, but Rachel stood in his place. "You did," she said, "not with what you taught, but with your silence when she needed you to protect her." Each person, as if waiting for someone to break the seal, began to rise to their feet. My son was forced to sit so still his legs went numb. My daughter came home and didn't speak a word for 2 weeks. I apologized to my child for not listening sooner. Dale stood still. His hand gripped the Bible, no longer steady. Then he stepped down from the pulpit, said nothing more. No denial, no bowing of the head, but no one followed him either. Emily returned to her seat. Jack held his daughter's hand. The small hand was still cold, but it no longer trembled. The church bell stayed silent. But in the hearts of everyone there, a sound had begun to ring out, clear as day, not to judge, not to punish, but to wake a town that had grown too used to calling silence peace. In the early hours of Tuesday morning, a silver-grey car pulled out of Bell's Hollow. No headlights, no goodbyes. Reverend Dale sat in the back seat, his robe neatly folded across his lap, eyes as still as a dusty windshield left unwiped. No one came to see him off. No lights came on in the church behind him. A few days earlier, a letter had appeared in the community opinions section of the local paper. Guidance or intimidation? When children no longer dare to lift their heads in church. Then came another letter. Then a brief segment aired on the local AM station, just a mother's voice, recounting how her child cried every Sunday night. No one named Reverend Dale directly, but everyone knew who they were talking about. At the coffee shop, greetings for the pastor began to fade. At the market, no one stopped to chat. Those who had once defended him either stayed silent or quietly stepped away. The looks people gave started to shift, not loud, but steady, like water slowly seeping through old tile. No one knew exactly where he was going, Just a sheet of paper taped to the church door, typed cleanly, neatly. I, Reverend Dale, am stepping down from my position due to health reasons. Thank you for the years of serving this community. No apology. No sign of remorse. Just leaving. The next morning, Jack stood on the church porch, reading the note for a while. He didn't take it down, didn't tear it up. He just looked at it, then turned away. In his pocket was a summons from the State Religious Oversight Board requesting his testimony in an internal investigation now underway after several families had filed official complaints. No one said it out loud, but Jack understood. Some people may be gone, but they haven't really left. The silence that once shielded Dale still cast its shadow over a few faces, those who still chose to bow their heads. But Jack knew the most important thing had already happened. The silence had been broken. In the late afternoon, Jack came home. As soon as he opened the door, he saw his mother Helen sitting at the kitchen table. For the first time in weeks, her brow wasn't furrowed. On the table was an old photo album, its blue fabric cover worn at the corners. She didn't speak right away. She simply pushed the album toward Jack, her hand lingering on the edge of the cover before letting go. "I was never good with words, and worse at being a mother," she said, her voice low and steady. "I thought staying quiet kept the peace, that it was the best way to let her grow up without getting hurt. But it seems I was wrong." She looked down and brushed at the corner of her blouse. It took her a few seconds to go on. "I don't know everything that happened, but I know there were things I should have seen sooner. I should have asked Emily. I should have listened more than I lectured." Jack didn't say anything. She turned to look at him, not to justify herself, but to be heard, just once, like she was learning how to be a mother all over again, late in life. "I'm not expecting you to forgive me right away, but if Emily can hear me, I just want her to know. Grandma's sorry for not standing by her sooner, and from now on, if she ever needs someone beside her, I'll be the first in line." Her eyes settled on the photo, in Jack's hand, a little girl grinning wide, cheeks smudged with frosting, a beam of light tilting across her forehead like a tiny halo. No one said anything more. But this time, the silence wasn't avoidance. It was a pause, careful and full, to hold on to something slowly returning. Trust. Carter gave a small nod, not to close the moment, but to keep it. That evening, Emily invited 2 of her classmates over. She made cookies with Jack flour all over her shirt, cookie shapes a little off. But she laughed. For the first time in months, Jack heard his daughter's real laughter rising in the kitchen, echoing up the wooden stairs, and landing in his heart like a soft kind of forgiveness. He stood at the doorway, watching the 3 girls sitting cross-legged on the floor, talking in the language only children know, the language of surviving hurt. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood still and understood. The war was over, but the healing had only just begun. The Bells Hollow schoolyard looked more radiant that morning than Jack had ever seen it. The sky was no longer the grey of long winter days, but a deep, straight-backed blue, like someone standing tall again after a storm. Children darted across the yard, their canvas shoes tapping the ground with a crisp rhythm, like the beat of a fresh heart. A light breeze carried the scent of early cherry blossoms from a corner of the yard. Jack stood beside his pickup truck, looking through the worn, silver-painted chain-link fence. In the distance, Emily sat on a stone bench, a small notebook in hand, telling something to 2 girls beside her. She didn't laugh too loudly, didn't wave her arms too much, but clearly she was no longer keeping herself small. Jack turned back to the truck bed and closed the lid on the last cardboard box. Inside were a few notebooks, some old army maps, a family photo frame, and a blank journal. On the outside, a handwritten note read, "Write it down, leave nothing behind." He sat down on the steps. Emily came running, still catching her breath, cheeks rosy from the sun. "Are you leaving for good?" she asked, eyes glancing toward the truck. "Not for good," Jack said, his voice as soft as the breeze. "Just stepping away for a while. I need time to write some things down, to sort them out, to name the things that never had a name." Emily sat down beside him, quietly. Jack went on, "I can't always be here, but you've learned how to speak, and that's enough." Emily rested her head against her father's chest. She didn't say anything more. That simple gesture needed no explanation. It was the one thing they'd always been missing, all those years. Across town, Bell's Hollow Church had reopened quiet now, no big bell. The new pastor was young, short hair, thin glasses, the kind who bowed his head and listened more than he preached. There were no afternoon morality classes, just a reading nook and a small weekly gathering for children who had something on their minds. No lectures on obedience, just one gentle question. "How are you feeling today?" Night. Jack left the house, started the engine, pulled away from Main Street. Inside, on the wooden table by the window, the drawing of the bench Emily once made still lay quietly. But now, it had a few new details. Tiny purple and yellow flowers growing low around the wooden bench. A child still sitting there, not curled up, but arms open, catching the sunlight. And behind her, the dark shadow that once loomed had faded. Nothing more than a trace of mist hanging on. No one explained. No one needed to. The sky that day stretched wide and open, a pale, honest blue, without a single cloud to hide behind. There was no wind, just the quiet rustle of tree leaves shifting now and then, like someone adjusting a blanket in their sleep. People stood around, not speaking, not because they didn't have words, but because none were necessary. Their presence said enough. And for the first time, in what felt like a very long time, no one was afraid of the silence. It wasn't empty. It wasn't awkward. It held them gently, like the space after a deep sigh, or the stillness right after a storm, when the world hasn't quite healed. But it's no longer breaking. In that quiet, they understood each other. And that was enough. The story of Jack and Emily wasn't just about a father returning from war. It was about the courage to stay silent and the courage to speak, about how, sometimes, to protect the ones we love, we don't need to shout. We just need to stay. We were raised in different ways, some with strict rules, some with quiet endurance, but what matters most is this. We have the courage to change when we know something's wrong. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between staying silent or speaking up? What helped you decide? If you're listening to this late at night, just before bed, don't forget to take a small sip of warm water, just a little. Let your body settle into peace, because after everything heavy we've just walked through together, maybe what we need most isn't advice, but a bit of gentleness toward ourselves. Wishing you a peaceful night.